One of the most unnerving times of my life came towards the end of my time as a missionary. My family and I had agreed to go on a year-end trip to Vietnam with some of our members. So we woke up early that morning of what was supposed to be the start of a fun trip to Vietnam via bus. The first part of the journey was a ride of over 200 kilometers to the Cambodia-Vietnam border. And when we finally reached, I was told that my family and I couldn't leave the country because of a visa issue. We had made an honest mistake of assuming that our tourist visa's expiry superseded our business visa's expiry. But the tourist visa would not have expired on the day we were to leave for Vietnam, but the business one had already. So of course, I lost that argument no matter how much I tried. Then, they told me that we had to get off the bus so that I could sort it out back in Phnom Penh, another 200 kilometers in the opposite direction. And they insisted that they could not settle it for me at the border. So we had no choice. We were holding up the entire bus, and we had to make the decision to say goodbye to our members so that they could continue on without us whilst we returned to sort things out. To be honest, when the bus left, that was when anxiety hit me like a brick. We were totally stranded with a newborn and 2 other young children in tow. And we had also just lost all local help at that time. So I used my limited conversational command and managed to find a driver who was willing to send us back home. And in the car, as I tried to process what had gone on and plan the next steps ahead, I never rested throughout the ride back until we actually reached home. Because whenever the driver received a call, I would listen very attentively to see if we were in any danger of being kidnapped. I was literally on heightened alert. And while traveling back, we found out that all we had to do was to pay a fine in Phnom Penh, and we would be able to leave the country. So we tried to book tickets to fly out to Vietnam that very evening, but the earliest flight was the next morning. So that night, I remember very clearly, I couldn't stop my mind from playing out the worst-case scenarios over and over again. And for once in my life, I could not sleep because my mind just refused to stop thinking about how to get my family across safely. And in the end, out of sheer exhaustion and desperation, I just surrendered the situation to the Lord. And I distinctively remember His assurance saying, "Haven't I always kept you and your family safe?" So with some level of peace restored, I slept whatever little I could. Morning came, and I sprung out of bed. I had never been this nervous before. I went to the airport resigned to meet with at least one of my worst-case scenarios I had in my head the entire night. But thank God for His grace. Much to my relief, and I must emphasize that it was huge, I went through customs without a hitch after paying the fine. The senior customs officer even thanked me and wished me a good journey as we left. We got on our flight, surprised our members in Vietnam, and went on to have a memorable trip. That was a real structured experience for me. I think I had never been more robbed of peace than this experience. Yet the simple prayer of submitting to God's authority in my life gave me an incredible insight. The peace that all of us long for in life, the kind of true and lasting peace that will keep you afloat and on course, even in the middle of a storm, can only be had when we have made peace with God. But how can men ever dare to dream of making peace with God? Well, yes, we can. Through the greatest miracle of God coming in the flesh, that is Jesus Christ, to die for our sins and pay our debt in full. So if we are able to make peace with God today, please let me share with you what that true and lasting peace looks like from a well-known miracle that Jesus performed over nature in Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. And it reads like this: "That day, when evening came, He said to His disciples, 'Let us go over to the other side.' Leaving the crowd behind, they took Him along just as He was in the boat. There were also other boats with Him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. And Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke Him and said, 'Teacher, don't you care if we drown?' He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, 'Quiet, be still.' Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to His disciples, 'Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?' They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Today, I'd like to share with you. The first point is this: peace is trusting in the presence of God. Now, this miracle was also recorded in the Gospels written by Matthew and Luke. But crucially, there's a little detail that Matthew recorded additionally that revealed things a little bit more interestingly. Of course, we know from all three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that three things happened, right? Number one, the disciples were rushing to wake Jesus up. Number two, Jesus rebuked the wind and the waves. And number three, Jesus rebuked the disciples for having fear instead of faith. We just don't know the order if we read either Mark or Luke's account. However, in Matthew's account, verse 26 gives us the order. Let's read from Matthew chapter 8, verse 26. And it says this: He replied, Jesus, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the wind and the waves, and it was completely calm. Did you notice the difference from Mark's account in verses 39 to 40 if you look at your outlines? Yes, if you are eagle-eyed, you will have noticed the smallest of details in the word then. Then tells us the sequence of events, and it's surprising. Now imagine with me for a minute. Imagine that I'm taking a nap with my children, and whether accidentally or intentionally, they set the house on fire. They are terrified and they wake me up, and I see the entire kitchen burning, and the first thing I say to them is, "Why are you making so much noise? How many times have I told you not to play with the lighter?" Do you think that would be my first reaction? Or any of you who are parents, would that be your first reaction? No, definitely not. The first thing I would do would be to put out the fire and eliminate the danger first. Once I have reasonably ensured that, then I would turn to my children and give them a mighty big scolding. But of course, I would still end it by teaching them the lesson they needed to learn. In other words, I would do the damage control before the debrief. Obviously, dealing with the danger first is more important than teaching the lesson, right? But did Jesus do that? No. In fact, Jesus did the exact opposite. He did the debrief before the damage control. And why would he do that? Was he displaying such a blatant lack of EQ in his response when the disciples were genuinely afraid for their lives? No. It was because the lesson he wanted to teach them was truly more important than the danger. That if they had gotten it, they would no longer view the danger as danger. What was Jesus' lesson then? Let's look at the story again, shall we? Jesus did not just rebuke the wind and the waves. Obviously, we know by now that Jesus woke up to rebuke his disciples first, calling them out for a lack of faith, and then asking them why they were so afraid. Yeah, right, never mind that they were in the midst of a fiercest storm they had ever been, and they were in real danger of dying. Yeah, Jesus, never mind all that. So Jesus appears to be really unreasonable, right? After all, the storm was real. Waves were pouring into the boat. They were taking in water fast. In other words, they were going to be sunk soon. The first and only time I visited Maldives, and it was truly a breathtakingly beautiful experience. I reached my oceanside villa when it was already nighttime. And I had specifically chosen this villa because I wanted that oceanside experience. And as soon as I had gone out to the back of the villa where the ocean was, I wanted to run right back in. When I realized how close the ocean was because of how big and loud the waves were, at that moment in the darkness of night, fear gripped my heart. I felt like I was literally standing next to nature in comical fashion. I was next to nothing, compared to the power of nature. And I distinctly remember thinking that even if the smallest recorded tsunami moved through this area, I would stand no chance whatsoever at surviving it. Unless, of course, a miracle happened. So, it was perfectly reasonable for the disciples to be afraid, right? Actually, don't you think that Jesus sleeping through it all seems the most unreasonable? Mark's account even says that Jesus was sleeping comfortably on his pillow at the back of the boat when this fierce storm threatened to shipwreck the boat they were on. So why should Jesus be rebuking his disciples? I believe that Jesus rebuked them because of this key reason. Jesus was in the boat with them, yet they were reacting like he was not. Now, it may not seem like much, but as far as Jesus is concerned, safety is not the absence of danger, but the presence of God. If they had understood that they were in the presence of God himself, they would not have been that fearful, because after all, the Savior of the world couldn't possibly fulfill his purpose dying in a shipwreck, could he? But the problem that the disciples displayed, and which is really how most of us respond naturally as humans, is that whenever we are in trouble, we don't feel the presence of God. God seems to be like Jesus, sleeping away, totally oblivious to our life and death needs while we get tossed about in the storm. And then we cry out like the disciples, "Don't you care, Lord?" But get this, precisely because he cares, that Jesus came to earth to be a man like one of us, to be with us. His name is Emmanuel, which literally means God is with us. If you're disappointed and hurting from things in your life, you can be sure that Jesus is not far away. He's right there with you in the middle of it. And he made sure to assure you of you and me of that with his very last words before leaving earth by saying, "I am with you always, even to the end." True, lasting peace is not the absence of danger, but the presence of God. Secondly, peace is trusting in the power of God. Storms are a powerful force of nature. Every year, tropical cyclones are tracked across the world, and to date, there have been 95 cyclones formed. The most intense cyclone so far had a 10-minute sustained period of 220 kilometers wind. And so far, the total fatality count worldwide currently stands at 568, with an estimated total damage of $8.25 billion. Fierce storms are humanly unstoppable. We simply have no answer to the sheer power of nature. So when the disciples saw the furious squall that came up, they did not even expect, much less know, that Jesus could calm the storm. Yes, they woke Jesus up, but only because they were desperately afraid and out of options in an increasingly bad situation. They expected Jesus to be able to do something, but surely not silence the storm with mere words. And you know what is interesting to me? It's interesting to me that some of these disciples were fishermen. In fact, they had spent all their lives fishing on this very lake known as the Sea of Galilee. And storms happened all the time. So storms were nothing new to this man, but this storm had them all completely spooked. They knew that this was no ordinary storm. They had lost any sense of control over the situation, and all they could think of in that moment was for these seasoned fishermen to wake a carpenter up to do something about it. The visa story that I shared at the beginning of this message gave me my first experience of being so anxiously tormented because I had absolutely no control whatsoever. At every turn of event, it felt like I had even less and less control of the situation. From being booted off the bus, to having to find my own way back, and the long car ride to Phnom Penh, to just missing out on the flights for that very same evening out to Vietnam, and finally, ultimately leading to that sense of dread of come what may at the airport the next day. As a Singaporean and someone who likes preparing for contingencies, it was absolutely terrifying to feel like you're at the complete mercy of someone or something else. Hence, my huge relief when I passed through customs without any of my worst fears being realized. That immediate halting of imminent danger, not because of my own preparedness or abilities, really humbled me on how powerless I truly am. And I think the immediate halting of imminent danger by Jesus for the disciples revealed how powerless they were as well. Also amplified because the contrast of the power of Jesus was on display. And it is interesting to look at the way Jesus spoke to the wind and the waves. He did not pray to God, "Dear God, please cause the storm to stop." Instead, he addressed the wind and the waves directly by rebuking them. A contemporary definition of rebuke is to speak angrily to someone because you disapprove of what they have said or done. In fact, one version of the Bible translates what Jesus said to the wind and the waves as, "Hush, be still." And I think that says best what was happening. In rebuking the wind and the waves, Jesus was demonstrating his authority and power over the storm as if it were like someone speaking to an unruly child who was making a lot of noise. Shh! Quiet! You're scaring my friends. To Jesus, the howling wind and the raging seas were no more threatening than a noisy young kid making a fuss. That's why he could do the debrief before the damage control, because he was 100% in control. It was unbelievable to the disciples then, and sometimes remains unbelievable to us today only because we forget who Jesus really is. Now, what comes to mind when you think of power? Is it a nuclear bomb? Volcanic eruption? Perhaps the 2004 Boxing Day Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami comes to mind. The earthquake released an equivalent of 23,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs, caused a tsunami that traveled at speeds of 800 kilometers per hour across 5,000 kilometers, claimed about 228,000 lives with 10-story high waves, and caused about USD 15 billion in damage. Now, most of the time, when we think about power, we think about something destructive. That's why when Jesus demonstrated his power over nature, the disciples were terrified. Who is he? They asked. Is Jesus a friend or foe? Was he going to top the previous storm off and finish them off? After all, even the winds and the waves obeyed him at the mere sound of his voice. But we really only struggle with this question when we either don't know or forget who Jesus really is. God's most powerful act was a saving one, not a destructive one. We see this from Ephesians chapter 1, verses 18 to 21. It says this, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in his holy people, and his incomparably great power for us who believe. That power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly realms, far above all rule and authority, power and dominion, and every name that is invoked, not only in the present age, but also in the one to come. If Christ has already conquered death, the one thing that every human being shares in common, and the biggest thing we have no control over, like when and how we die, we know two things. That one, Christ's power is immeasurable. And number two, his power is always used for our good. So we're assured that when storms in our life come up and snatch control out of our hands, he has the power to silence them and restore control in his way that is for our good. True, lasting peace is not the illusion of control, but the power of God. And finally, peace is trusting in the promises of God. You know, there's another reason why Jesus rebuked his disciples. They didn't take him at his word. What did Jesus say to his disciples at the start, even before they set out in verse 35? Jesus said, let us go over to the other side. The destination was already revealed and set. He didn't say, let us go for a swim in the lake, guys. And notice, Jesus also didn't say, let me go over to the other side. Instead, he said, let us go over to the other side. The disciples were already included and set. Jesus was not going to wait until the squall swallowed the boat to get up from his afternoon nap and then walk on water alone for the rest of the way to the other side. You know, whatever Jesus says, he will do. Storm or no storm. We can always take Jesus at his word, and that's why Jesus rebuked his disciples for their lack of faith. He had already promised that all of them would go over to the other side. The outcome was already assured. Storm or no storm. But I can totally identify with the disciples because even after I had prayed and God reminded me about how he had always taken care of my family and would continue to do so, there was still a part of me, right, a small part of me that remained anxious about the unknown, especially since the stakes were high. And that was exactly why Jesus called the disciples out for their lack of faith, because faith rests not on what we see that is happening to us, but on the promises of God of what will happen to us. That's why Jesus said, blessed is he who does not see and yet believe. All of us long for peace in our lives, right? However, our most common understanding of peace is the absence of problems. A fair weather peace. We wish for smooth sailing lives where the sun would always shine, the birds would always sing, and the good times would always last. Unfortunately, we know that life is not always like that. Like thunderstorms, troubles have a sneaky knack for breaking suddenly, unexpectedly, and even violently into our lives. Last week, if you're a football fan, the news in Barcelona was all about Lionel Messi, arguably the greatest player to have ever lived, leaving the football club he joined as a 13-year-old after 21 years. Tears were shed at a dramatic farewell press conference. However, almost exactly 4 years ago today, tears were shed for the victims of a terrorist attack in Barcelona. A newly wedded couple on a honeymoon were cruelly parted as the husband was mowed down by a van. A child holding his mother's hand, taking in all the sights and sounds, suddenly sees a van rushing at them, and that would be the last thing they ever saw. I followed news about this attack because my cousin was at that very street when the terror attacks happened, and he managed to barricade himself in the cafe he was at and waited till it was safe to get out. The fact is that bad things happen, sometimes in a seemingly unfair way. Why him? Her? Not me. Why me? Not him? Her? But there is really no immunity for anyone. The doctor tells you that you only have months left. A family member walks out on you. A phone call in the middle of the night delivers devastating news. You report to work, only to find your desk cleared out. It happens. Bad things happen. We all know that troubles can come to us at any time. That's life. The problem is that once they do, we become fixated on ourselves. That's why Jesus rebuked his disciples about their lack of faith. Once awoken, you find that Jesus didn't ask them, why didn't they do this or didn't do that to improve the situation? Instead, he directed attention onto himself as if to say, guys, didn't I already say, let us go over to the other side just now? God will see us through the fiercest storms in our lives simply because he has promised to do so. And his promise is not just for the next life that especially as Christians, we know without a doubt, but also for this life as well. What does he promise? Let's read from John 14:27. And it says this, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled and do not be afraid. Don't you find the words of the last sentence strikingly similar to what Jesus said to his disciples? We cannot stop troubles from coming into our lives, but we can find a peace that is not shaken by our troubles. Don't you think that it would be wonderful to have that kind of peace? Peace in the storm. Peace even in the midst of trouble. A peace that literally goes beyond our understanding and one that is not fair weather. If that is what you want, then know who Jesus is. Remember who he is in life. Remember his promise of peace that he gives to you. Remember his promise that he will be with you till the very end. If Jesus is a man so much in control of things that he can stop a storm, he would also be able to fulfill any promise he makes to you and me. I know it's not easy to stop focusing on the issues in front of us. The pain of the current easily detracts us from the promises of the future. But the truth is that there are things in our lives that we don't know if they will get any better. The pain of a loss that only seems to grow with time. The regrets of a decision that only seem to compound guilt with time. The suffering of a condition that only seems to worsen with time. Sometimes we are afraid, sometimes we're angry, sometimes we are both. And we wish that Jesus would just come in now and give us a miracle where our current situations are met with a divine intervention leading to our desired outcome. No doubt there are times when Jesus will do that for us, but for the times he seemingly doesn't, he has already given us the miracle of divine peace in this life, bought with his own blood, to deal with the earthly pain, suffering, and death we will all go through. The storms of life may douse our hearts with fear, but Jesus promises to light them up again with faith in who he is and what he says. For true, lasting peace is not the certainty of sight, but the promises of God. Then maybe instead of frantically looking to Jesus to command the storms in our life, to be still, just to end our pain and danger immediately. We will be truly blessed when we desire for our hearts to be still. No matter what storms you are going through in life, may you discover the miracle of true peace in Jesus' presence, power, and promises when He stills your heart.